In the 17th century, an inspiring host gathered people together, the purpose to increase their knowledge through conversation. These gatherings were called salons. Guests would debate a topic for the evening, mostly books, then eat and drink tea. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the High Tea with the Vice Chancellor. It's good to see you. I don't know if it's just me, when a Friday comes and there's no high tea, I know this is once per month. I feel like I'm having some withdrawal symptoms of some sort. Sometimes I feel like I could push the month so that we can meet and I can see you again. Let me use this opportunity to welcome those that are joining us virtually. This high tea will not be what it is, without your support. So we thank each and every one of you. Ladies and gentlemen, two things. Firstly, let me introduce our guest today, and then after that, I'll introduce the book, and then I will have a conversation with our guest, the author of the book we're going to discuss today. And after that, as always, then we'll open this up for you to engage with the author, also with me, if you like, but I'm not an expert in this field, and yeah. So our guest today is no stranger to the great University of Johannesburg, Professor Adebajo. I call him Brother Ade. So if you hear me from time to time saying Brother Ade, don't be surprised. We come a long way. We traveled. I remember us visiting the Caribbean some donkey years ago. Yeah. You haven't aged a day since those days. I don't have hair anymore. It's good to see you. Ladies and gentlemen, on a serious note, Professor Adekeye Adebajo is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. He previously served here at the great university as the director of the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation, IPATC, and that was between 2017 and 2021.
Exactly.
Yes. And he also served as executive director of the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town between 2003 and 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Adebayo served on the United Nations missions in South Africa, Western Sahara, and Iraq, and was director of the Africa program at the International Peace Institute in New York. He's a well-read, well-educated man. His highest qualification is a PhD from Oxford. And yeah, let's give Prof Adebayo a warm round of welcome. Prof, welcome to the great University of Johannesburg.
Thank you very much. And when he calls me brother, please remember I'm not a pastor.
Yes. Prof Adebayo is a thought leader. I mean, he writes regularly on topical issues in various newspapers in South Africa, in Nigeria, in the US, all over. And he publishes regularly, I mean, the rate at which Prof publishes his books, he can keep us busy for the whole year. When we talked about doing high tea together, he brought two books, voluminous books, and we had to choose one. And I chose this. I saw how you looked at me, Prof. Firstly, the title, The Spendid Tapestry of African Life, Essays on a Resilient Continent, Its Diaspora, and the World, published by Chakana in 2024. UJ is an African university. We're proud of our Pan-African roots. And it's important that we discuss issues that concern our beautiful continent. And I can't think of any person who is so well-read, who has contributed so much about almost everything about this beautiful continent of ours. This book, ladies and gentlemen, has got 145 essays divided in 10 parts, covering topics, ranging from reparations, apologies, sport and culture, the relationship between South Africa and Nigeria, multilateralism, regional integration, the list goes on. We're not going to cover everything, but we're going to engage on 8 or 10, topics that may force us to cover as much as we can. Then we open it up for you to also speak to Prof. Ade. He kindly brought copies with him. Of course, they are for sale. And we thank him for doing that, because then he has saved us time to go to exclusive books to buy this book. And he kindly agreed that there will be a minute or two to autograph the books for those that will be able to acquire them this afternoon. So, Prof. Adam, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Without any waste of time, Prof. Adam, I thought I should start with this important issue. Africa has been subjected to a lot of terrible things. I mean, we've got a terrible history, history of suffering and so on, and we're still trying to address many of the issues that arise from colonialism, imperialism, and so on. And one of the big issues is the issue of reparations.
Yes.
Do you think as Africans we will ever be, compensated enough for our challenges? Maybe let's start with just to get those reparations, that compensation.
Thank you, VC, and it's great to be back here again, where I spent 5 very rewarding years.
Wonderful.
I think the issue of reparations is absolutely crucial, and as we meet here, the second African Union Caribbean Community CARICOM meeting is actually going on in Addis Ababa, where they're discussing issues of reparations.
Right.
This year, 2025, has been declared by the African Union as the Justice for Peoples of African Descent and Africa for reparations for slavery and colonialism. And that's been extended to a decade till 2036. So for the next decade, at least, that is going to be a major focus of our continental organization. I think the argument is quite clear. For 5 centuries, basically, more or less between 4 centuries, between 1450 and 1888, 7 European countries basically undertook the transatlantic slave trade, where they took 12 to 15 million Africans, some in their most productive prime, out of the continent of Africa and enslaved them to work as free labor. Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, we should name them. And their societies benefited tremendously. A lot of the Western industrialization was through this centuries of slave labor. A lot of America's own success was built on the cotton that was picked on southern plantations. And there was massive amounts of rape and exploitation, people thrown out of the ships that were transporting them across the Atlantic. Many of them that went to Jamaica, for example, were worked 14-hour days on plantations in the sun, and many did not survive more than 10 years or 15 years. And so that was passed on from generation to generation. And the argument that is being made is there was a Durban UN conference against racism that took place in 2001 that was very important in trying to mobilize support for reparations. More recently, you've seen Black Lives Matter, and even Rhodes Must Fall went global to many universities across the world from South Africa, calling for justice for those colonial and slave era crimes. And the African Union or the Organization of African Unity, as it was then, in 1993, came up with a proclamation that basically called for monetary compensation, for debt annulment, for Africa's place to be strengthened in institutions of global governance like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF. These are all calls we're still making. 3 decades later or whatever it is. So, or 4 decades later. And then the Caribbean community also has been even more active than the Africans in coming up with a 10-point plan, which has actually served as a template for many grassroots activists on this issue. And it's called for debt annulment as well, but also restitution, returning the money that was actually paid to the slave owners. So you had this colossal crime, and instead of paying the victims of the crime, what Britain, the Americans, and the European countries did was actually to pay the slave owners instead. So in the case of Britain, they paid 20 million pounds, 3 billion pounds equivalent of today's money to these slave owners in 1834 when they were supposedly emancipating their slaves. And I'll just make one last point. The African Union in 2023 got together with CARICOM and also came up with their own declaration, which basically set up a global fund, called for cooperation with the UN. And one of the most important things also in many of these OAU and AU plans is the right of diaspora people in what's called the Black Atlantic, in North America, in South America, etc. Because we often focus too much on America, but 40% of the slaves actually went to Cuba and Brazil. And Brazil today has one of the largest Black or mixed race populations in the world. It's about third or so. So those are really the issues regarding reparations, but the case is absolutely incontestable, but we're also in a difficult environment. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about the current occupant in the White House, because everything he's doing is diametrically opposed to things like reparations.
Now, Brother Ade, yes, when we talk about reparations, we tend to focus on money. Money is important. Money makes the world go around. But the issues, that must be addressed go beyond just monetary compensation.
Absolutely.
There was a lot of theft of some priceless artifacts, from the continent.
Yes.
There are people who have been robbed of their dignity, who were taken to lands far away and paraded like animals as part of, circus shows and so on. I mean, I'm thinking of Sarah Bartman.
Absolutely.
How important is it to look at this holistically for us as Africans and for the continent, to bring closure to this sad history?
It's absolutely important, and it's a good point that you raise, because the OAU proclamation of 1993 that I talked about actually called for the return of Africa's artifacts and art and objects that were looted, many of which still remain in European museums today. And from the 2010s, the European countries started to return some of them, but the vast majority still have not been returned. One incident that is worthy of remembering is that the first genocide of the 20th century was actually not the Nazi Holocaust. It was the genocide that the Germans undertook in Namibia, which was their colony of Southwest Africa, next door to you here. And they managed to wipe out 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama population. And what they did was, it was almost like a dress rehearsal for the Nazi Holocaust, because they put a lot of them in concentration camps, and they started doing experiment on skulls, and many skulls were actually transported to Germany, some of which have now started to be returned. And so there were these grisly experiments. And we should actually mention, Vice Chancellor, some of the reparations that have started to be made and restitution, because as you said, it's not just about money. So Germany paid or agreed to pay 1.1 billion euros for this genocide, which they had been denied, and they finally acknowledged. In 2021, they agreed to put in 1.1 billion euros, basically for social development that would benefit the Herero and Nama populations. There has been some controversy because some of the civic groups from those communities have not agreed with the approach and felt that they weren't consulted enough. The Dutch apologized in 2022 for Dutch slavery, a lot of which was in the Caribbean, but some of it in the Cape also. And they set up a 200 million euro fund to look at how they could actually undertake restitution for those actions. And then more recently, universities like Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, Glasgow, which benefited enormously from slavery, have also started making restitution, sometimes in the form of scholarships to Caribbean citizens and things like that. So there are many ways to do this. It's not only through monetary compensation. And the last thing I must say, VC, is that the Church of England also set up in 2023 a £100 million fund when it was discovered that they had also benefited from slave trade. So you had the devil and God marching in lockstep.
Brother Ade, yes, we talk about the past. Let's switch gears, change gears a little bit and talk about the present and the living. Many of our brothers and sisters abroad, sometimes when they talk about the motherland, it's like, they talk about some, we live here. And then when you listen to them and you wish these guys should visit the continent more often, interact with the people on the continent, understand the culture. And I must really commend a number of countries, especially in West Africa, that have come up with initiatives such as the Year of the Return. I remember Ghana had the Year of the Return. Absolutely. And inviting people to come back, who are descendants of those people who were forcibly removed from the continent. Yeah. And I'm wondering what more can be done to make sure that the African diaspora connects more with the motherland and its people, its cultures, but also the people on the continent reach out, invest in the Caribbean, support, those brothers and sisters, who are descendants of those people who were forcibly removed from the continent.
Yeah. I think there have been more recently some efforts. There's a big African American community here in South Africa.
Right.
They may not be very visible, but they're certainly here as both investors and doing other things, contributing to many different sectors. So that we mustn't forget.
Right.
I think there are also cultural things that can connect the diaspora and Africa, because Nollywood, for example, is something that became the Nigerian film industry, not just big in Africa, but in the Caribbean. People really...
Also in the Caribbean?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, I didn't know.
People could identify with many of the characters and the stories and the... even the way that women were portrayed, it wasn't kind of like Western notions of beauty necessarily, but African ones. So there are many different angles like that. Stevie Wonder moved to Ghana under the encouragement of people to return to the continent. And one thing that's also important is that between 1970 and 2020, the number of Africans living in America what Ali Mazrui called American Africans as opposed to African Americans doubled every decade. And by 2020 was 2.4 million people.
Right.
Most of them are from Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Ghana. And in many US cities, you'll see their influence. Many of them have even been in policy-making positions within various US administrations. And that is a diaspora that I think can also be tapped for Africa's benefit. The amount of remittances that this diaspora sends back to Africa is now more than the aid and investment we receive from outside combined.
Wow.
So many governments like Senegal and Nigeria and others have set up ministries of diaspora to try to capture and take advantage of this remittances and trying to encourage people to come back. But we mustn't also forget the history of it, because the anti-apartheid struggle, for example, in the US was led by a lot of African-American groups like Trans-Africa, Randall Robinson, and a lot of the Congressional Black Caucus. And it was their efforts, along with their white congressional colleagues, that overrode Ronald Reagan's veto and made sure that sanctions were imposed on South Africa in 1986 and helped in the process of ending apartheid. So that link and that bridge has been there for a long time. And we must remember Pan-Africanism was born not in Africa, but in the Americas and the Caribbean. A lot of the church groups from the 18th century that were advocating for Africa's freedom and liberation and an end to slavery, and even the 5 Pan-African conferences that were held between 1919 and 1945. People like W.E.B. Du Bois and George Padmore were from America and the Caribbean rather than Africa. So that history has been there. We need to rebuild those bridges now.
Yes. Brother Ade, I remember Muammar Gaddafi when he talked a lot about the United States of Africa.
Yeah.
I'm just putting words, but that is basically what he called for, United Africa.
Yeah.
And we've got regional economic communities. I mean, SADC here, the Southern African Development Community, ECOWAS, and so on, that call for regional integration. We've got the AU, that calls for Africa Free Trade Area, but progress is slow.
Yeah.
We seem as Africans to suffer from self-hate, and I'll tell you why. We have these aspirations, we have these dreams, which are extremely important. We need freedom of movement of persons.
Absolutely.
But we know about xenophobic attacks, especially in South Africa.
Yeah.
We talk about free movement of goods and services, which is a nightmare throughout the continent, and which I believe is one thing that is locking up growth, economic growth. If we can sort that out, amongst many other things, we'll do well. Now, the point that I'm getting at when I talk about self-hate is where for us as Africans to visit each other, to trade with each other, we've got artificial barriers that we do not impose on people from Europe.
Yeah.
Mr. Aliko Dangote from Nigeria, you know him very well, the richest man on the continent, I believe, raised one important point that stayed with me when I read, and I'm like, this self-hate has to stop. When he said for him to travel on the continent, to do business on the continent, he needs visas to travel. And your passport is in there, you wait and so on. He can't compete with his competitors from Europe who can visit almost every country visa-free. How can we address this issue as Africans? What will it take for us to open our eyes, or our leaders' eyes, to say we need to continue to work together? And I must be quick to point out that other countries are starting to do away with these barriers, but things are happening at a slow pace. I know Rwanda, Ghana now, we don't need visas to go to Ghana, and so on.
Yeah, I think it's a really serious problem. I mean, the whole idea of regionalism started right from Africa's independence in the 1960s. So before the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, was born, you had different blocks, the Casablanca, the Monrovia, the Brazzaville, competing against each other. And what the Organization of African Unity did in 1963 was to try to unite all of these countries. But it was the lowest common denominator. So Nkrumah's vision, which was the most federalist, which called for a common currency, and an African high command to be able to promote common security and to have, a borderless Africa where you would be able to industrialize and have common institutions to be able to promote economic integration and joint infrastructure. That never came into existence because many of these countries had just won their sovereignty back, and they were not ready for such ambitious cooperation. The best way to look at it is to compare it in a way to the European Union. Europe was also fighting wars consistently, wars that were even more bloody and destructive than the African ones, until 1945, when they decided that in order for France and Germany to be united, they basically made a bargain between French agriculture and German industry, it's what we know as the European Union today, but started as the European Coal and Steel Community. And then from 6 members went to 12 members, the European Economic Community, and today it's 27 members. And it's the most successful form of cooperation and supranationalism in the world. Without the European Union, Europe would basically be quite voiceless in the world, even though it's an economic giant and a political dwarf, as we saw from the recent negotiations with Donald Trump, where they really just capitulated. I think if Africa can try to promote some of those things, because you see, colonialism and slavery that we referred to earlier did tremendous political, economic, social, cultural damage and dislocation to Africa. We're the only continent with 16 landlocked countries. And these countries basically all reflect European political compromises rather than African geography or cultures. So without actually tying our efforts to larger markets, many of these Lilliputian countries cannot industrialize no matter what. In the case of ECOWAS, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali military governments just left ECOWAS in January 2025. For me, it's one of the most destructive acts of self-harm that you can actually undertake, because ECOWAS is one of the areas of the highest mobility in the world, bar none. And most of those markets are tied to the rest of the 12 ECOWAS countries. So if those very small countries want to industrialize and develop, they're not going to be able to do it on their own. Fortunately, they've said they will continue to allow free movement of people, goods, and services. But ECOWAS has lost 17% of its population and nearly half of its territory as a result of this move that was made by these countries. And I don't think they're going to be able to move forward. Africa needs something in the region of $120 to $150 billion every year in infrastructure to make up for the lack of roads, rails, ports that we need. But yet we've declared an African continental free trade area in 2021 without actually building the 5 strong sub-regional pillars in ECOWAS, SADC, Central Africa, etc., before we can move forward. There's still a lot of non-tariff barriers in Africa. And as you've said, people don't seem to believe in free movement of people. They see people as a security threat from elsewhere. I mean, I still carry a Nigerian passport. We talk about how bad the US and Europe is, but if I want to go to Europe, they will at least give me a 2-year visa. If I want to go to America, I'm able to, or I was able before Trump to get a 5-year visa, and I made sure I got it before he took office. But if I want to go to tiny Lesotho or Namibia, it's such a hassle. Often I have to go and see the ambassador because they're delaying the whole thing. And then they'll give you maybe a 5-day single entry visa. So we really do need to take free movement of people, goods, services a lot more seriously, and the cooperation that needs to happen to get our act together, because only when we're a united market can we actually attract the levels of investment that we're going to need to be able to move forward. And we can't industrialize with such small markets as well. So it's definitely an issue, regional integration, without which Africa can't move forward. We have intra-African trade of 15%. In Asia, it's about, I think, Southeast Asia, at least about 40%. And in the European Union, it's about 60 to 70%. So it's definitely an issue we need to address. And for that, you need visionary, strong leadership. You need leaders in Nigeria and South Africa, who are 60% of the West and Southern African economy, to have a vision of how they can use that strength to promote regional integration and drag everybody else along, as Japan did in Asia, as the US did in North America, as Germany is doing in Europe. We need those regional hegemons, I've long argued.
Yeah. So the eagle and the springbok must work together.
Absolutely.
And for that to happen, we need strong leaders, to strengthen relations, trade between our two countries, but also lead the way, in terms of cooperation on the African continent. Brother Ade, some people say Africa should rise. Some say Africa will rise. Some say Africa is rising. Which one? Because some days I think Africa is rising, and then some days I'm like, oh, one day Africa will rise. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, for me, we tend to, or at least not we actually, I think we're a bit more realistic on the continent. We're Afro-realists. We're neither Afro-pessimists nor undue Afro-optimists. But there's an extreme and a kind of binary in the way Africa is often interpreted. I think mostly from the West, and a lot of the Western journalists are guilty of this. So it's either paradisiacal Eden, as Africa as the beginning of the world, where the Garden of Eden was located before paradise was lost, or apocalyptic Armageddon. So it's the stereotypes of wars and HIV/AIDS and all the negative things we see about Africa. But in my view, we're neither going to hell nor heaven. We're going to remain in some kind of purgatory until we resolve many of the problems we've just been talking about. The Economist magazine of London came up with a cover of a gun-totten youth with an AK-47 to represent Africa, and the headline, "The Hopeless Continent" in 2000. That was Richard Dowden, their Africa correspondent. And they got a lot of heat for it. And then in the 2010s, feeling guilty, they did a kind of mea culpa where they did a cover of Africa rising. So we're falling, we're rising, we're falling and rising again. I think you need to look at Africa in the way you would look at any other continent in terms of the good, the bad, the ugly. There are 55 countries of very diverse achievements, in terms of endowments and all sorts of things. And so I think the differentiation, distinction, nuancing is the most important thing. I mean, obviously, as Africans, we're disappointed. The continent as a whole is not doing better than it should be, that there are more conflicts than we would like, etc. And there have been massive aid cuts now, not just humanitarian aid, but assistance to programs like HIV/AIDS. In fact, the Lancet Medical Journal estimated that as a result of Trump closing down the US Agency for International Development, in the next, I think it was 10 years, 14 million people could die that may have been prevented if that support had been there. So there's a real urgency now to find a lot of homegrown solutions. The Europeans have also cut. They've just done it more quietly. They tend to be more cynical and less upfront than somebody like Trump, who has absolutely no filter or self-awareness. But it's a real crisis that we're in at the moment, and we're going to need to find a lot of homegrown solutions, a lot of self-help, and a lot of community organizations and NGOs are going to go out of business as a result of this funding crisis. So it could be an opportunity for Africa to actually fall back on its own resilience and sense of innovativeness that has allowed us to survive 5 centuries of very brutal and savage slavery and colonialism.
Yeah. 84 days to go before G20 being held for the first time on the African continent. My question is, how can African nations, countries, leverage this opportunity? I say opportunity in inverted commas because it could be just another event if it's not used fruitfully.
Yeah. Well, first, a bit of background on the group of 20, I think, is important. It was set up first in 1999, I think, in the wake of the Asian financial crisis of 97. And its mandate is basically to coordinate economic governance among the main industrialized and rich countries, 20 of them. They account for about 85% of global GDP. And then in 2008, what had been mainly finance ministers and at ministerial level was upgraded to head of state level. And South Africa's is the first African presidency. And those 20 countries rotate for 1 year each. So it's your BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, your Western countries like the US, Canada, Germany, France, and then the EU is there, and the AU was invited to join in 2023. South Africa is the first African chair, and I think what South Africa has done very well is to try to promote both African and global South interests and priorities. And South Africa is also taken over from 3 global South and now BRICS members. So Indonesia, India, Brazil last year, and now South Africa. And they've tried to coordinate so that their global South priorities. I think the African priorities that South Africa has tried to promote, debt, sustainability, and even debt suspension sometimes. The kind of reform of institutions of global governance like the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, so that Africa and other global South countries can have more impact in there. The environmental and just energy transition issues, and the fact that rich countries who are the main polluters haven't delivered on many of their pledges. And then things like how to manage critical minerals. Those are the issues that South Africa has tried to basically prioritize. And it's also set up a committee to advise on how to strengthen the African Union's Agenda 2063 and African Agenda. The main problem that South Africa has is, of course, each chair of the G20 is important in setting the agenda, but it cannot impose decisions on the other 19 countries. You need consensus. And at the moment, the Trump administration is being very difficult. It's boycotted at the high level the finance and foreign ministers meetings that have happened in South Africa. Trump has hinted he may not come for the summit in Nasrec in two months' time or 3 months' time or so. And along with Argentina and Italy, they've really played a spoiler role within the G20, blocking consensus, blocking decisions and communiques being adopted. So we must keep that in mind as well. But I think South African diplomats have done a tremendous job. You know, I've organized 2 or 3 meetings with South African diplomats and been involved in one of their mid-year review sessions. They've done incredible and indefatigable work in terms of actually taking this African G20 meeting seriously and trying to promote those priorities that I've just named. And South Africa has the mandate and task now to review the first cycle of all 20 chairs. You know, it's the 20th chair to take over. So it's going to review and do a very important report. But the next chair, unfortunately, is the US.
Yeah. My last question before I invite the audience to engage with you. The United Nations is 80 this year. Now, what steps can the UN take to enhance its support for the development of African countries?
The UN remains a very important organization and is the only kind of universal organization with 193 members, but it's going through a very severe crisis at the moment, especially financial crisis. That funding that I'm talking about that was withdrawn, much of it from the US. The US was funding typically 25% of the UN's peacekeeping, about 10 to 30% of its humanitarian work through many of its agencies like the Food and Agriculture Organization. Trump has withdrawn from the World Health Organization, which he did in his first term in the middle of the COVID pandemic. He's threatened to withdraw from UNESCO. So it's really triggered a crisis for the UN in that it's having to reduce due to a financial crisis and reduce its staff, and its capacity and funding has been much reduced. What the West did when they set up the UN was they wanted to focus largely on security issues and development issues. They like to do that within institutions like the World Bank and IMF, where they have weighted voting and where they control, rather than the UN, where you have equal voting within the UN General Assembly. And so much of the economic kind of resources, if you like, are not controlled by the UN through its Economic and Social Council. They're controlled more by these Western-dominated institutions, which is why we keep calling for them to be reformed. So But I wouldn't completely dismiss the UN in the sense that the UN helped bring peace to African countries like Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Burundi. It also failed spectacularly over the genocide in Rwanda and in places like Somalia and Angola. But another important dimension of the UN, and I know as a lawyer, you're also engaged with these issues, VC, is the reform of the UN Security Council. You know, when the UN and Susie Graham works a lot on this issue, and we've collaborated also on these issues. When the UN was founded in 1945, about 29% of its membership was on the Security Council. Today, that's 8%. Africa accounts for about a third of the UN's membership, but along with Latin America and the Caribbean, does not have any permanent membership or veto power on the UN Security Council. So it's very important also that we continue to call for the reform of its structures, because that's where most of the main decisions are made. The Security Council is the only one which can make decisions that are binding on all 193 countries. So we need more than just 3 rotating seats. You need countries like, I have argued, South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, India, to come onto the UN Security Council and make it a more democratic council for 2025, not reflecting the world of 1945, because Britain and France have no business being on the UN Security Council as permanent members. They're no longer great powers, clearly. And countries like India, Brazil, etc., are going to overtake them in terms of their GDP and are already overtaking them. So we need to also reform the UN to reflect the world of today, not 80 years ago.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Adekeye Adebajo. Warm round of applause.
So in terms of AI, I feel that you're kind of setting me up, because this library is library 4.0, and the vice chancellor next to me is one of the disciples of the 4IR and Africa. So I feel like I'm kind of like being set up in a way. I'm in a trap. But more seriously, AI is obviously going to have an impact on the whole world, and Africa cannot escape that.
True.
In terms of robots replacing people's jobs, in terms of all sorts of negative impacts of technology being developed outside, and Africa being a recipient and it impacting on Africa, rather than Africa actually being able to co-develop or respond to it in a way that might benefit it. But others have also pointed out benefits, like being able to leapfrog, use AI to leapfrog some of the industrialization challenges that we've talked about today. So I think, like much else, it's going to depend on how Africa's leadership actually takes AI and uses it, thinks about how it can incorporate it into its own development challenges. And we're going to need lots of, obviously engineers and other African scientists that are going to be able to put Africa at the forefront of those trying to shape how things develop and work. But I think it's absolutely inescapable, and it will be important that we don't get left behind. If we got left behind the other industrial revolutions, this one we certainly can't afford to let leave us behind. In terms of reparations, I didn't end it with slavery. I started with slavery. But the reparations that the African Union is calling for is for slavery and colonialism, as I noted. And we should actually highlight what happened in the Belgian Congo, because Adam Hochschild wrote a wonderful book, King Leopold's Ghost, I think, which noted that about half of the population, 10 million people, died as a result of really horrible and savage, labor policies, cutting off arms, killing people, working people to deaths, etc., in what was effectively a personal fiefdom of the Belgian king. So certainly you make a good point. And in the book that we produced, The Black Atlantic, on slavery, colonialism, and reparations, we made sure that all three of them were there. But one of the chapters was on reparations for British colonialism, because the author, Berkeley's Stephen Small, felt that there was too much focus on slavery and not enough on colonialism. What I mentioned in terms of the German genocide in Namibia, it's an act of colonialism rather than slavery. So clearly, we need to look at slavery and colonialism. Some would even argue neocolonialism, because France going around the continent like a pyromaniac fireman, shuffling around regimes like a deranged poker player, flying in a president into Central African Republic to replace Bokassa when he'd become an embarrassment. That also did a lot of damage. France has now been thrown out of Niger, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Chad, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, because of exploitative military and economic policies that continued well into the paper independence or the flag independence. So you're absolutely right. But I think tactically and strategically, better to focus on the slavery and colonialism than on the neo-colonialism. But I agree with you that colonialism, those were very big crimes, as people like Carolyn Elkins at Harvard have pointed out. And then there's this question of Africa as Gauteng, or dare we say the Western Cape. The Western Cape would be a dangerous one, VC, because that would mean Africa is led by the DA. But I think in terms of One Africa, it's an absolutely wonderful idea. And it's the idea that would make the most sense, because if you look at something like the United States of America, sorry, those were 50 states that had to fight a civil war between 1861 to 65 to stay together. But there was no guarantee that Lincoln would have won that war. If Lincoln had lost that war, 13 colonies would have broken away, and there would have been another Canada in that region, and the US wouldn't have been as united or as strong as it is today. And the way you know that this is an arrangement that makes sense is that anybody can decide in any of the 50 states just to pack up if you're living in New York, and you can move across the continent to California and set up a new life, or go to Chicago. And there are no borders. They're the same things that you would expect anywhere where you are. China, it's the same sort of thing, where you have a very powerful country, what's the second largest population in the world. And the advantage that China, like America, has is that it's more homogeneous than Africa is. So in America, they have more or less English and Spanish as the main languages. I know Trump is trying to insist on just English, but in China as well, the majority are Han Chinese. And so you have that homogeneity to keep them together. In Africa, you have a lot of different languages. It's not clear who would be the president of the United States of Africa. You know, would it be the South African president, the Nigerian president, the king of Lesotho, the king of Swaziland? It's hard for elites in all of these 55 countries to give up their privileges and territory for a supranational body. So what may be most practical is what I described to you, the European Union model, where these countries still keep their own units, but they basically decide that a certain percentage of their GDP is going to go towards transferring powers to in their case, institutions in Brussels. So they have an EU Commission, which is the bureaucracy that implements and can actually also initiate legislation. They have a European Parliament in Strasbourg. They have a European Council, which is where the heads of states basically help to still have oversight. Those are the kinds of things that Africa needs eventually to develop. But in our case, we have an African Union Commission, which is less than 1,000 people compared to 33,000 people in the European Union Commission. They don't have any supranational powers. Most of the decisions are still made by the heads of state. And you have a Pan-African Parliament that has no legislative powers. They're just there in Midrand as a talk shop collecting per diem. And then you have a NEPAD, a New Partnership for Africa's Development, which is the economic arm. Unfortunately, not as much capacity or resources. You have an African peer review mechanism that is toothless. It has no teeth to actually sanction countries. And you have an ECOSOC that doesn't really have a very strong civil society promoting accountability on the AU Commission. So our institutions haven't yet been built in a way that, even though they try to replicate and mirror the European Union, they haven't been built on such strong foundations. In terms of return of cultural artifacts, I think was asked about. Certainly, I agree that this should be speeded up, but unfortunately, I'm not sure what other means we have. Perhaps we could try to go to courts, you know, the International Court of Justice or other courts like that to try to, or even some of the Western domestic courts to try to force pressure. But I think we have to continue to insist through political pressure. You know, Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a fight. It never has and it never will. So you need to maintain consistent pressure. It's the only way that slavery, colonialism, all of these things ended. It's the only way that any reparations has even been paid. So it's important that we just continue through governments, through the AU, through CARICOM, through civil society, importantly. There are lots of very activist grassroots communities all over the world, in the Americas, in Europe, in Africa, and the Caribbean is particularly strong in terms of these grassroots activists. So I think that's what we've got to continue to actually have that kind of restitution, because those artworks actually represent not just people's culture, but in some ways their history, their personalities, you know. So it's extremely important that we keep up the pressure on cultural restitution. In terms of your issue, the question there about financial institutions, you have the African Development Bank, which is based in Abidjan, and you also have the Africa Export Import Bank. I think there's certainly a lot of potential in those banks to be able to encourage infrastructure development, to be able to encourage regional integration projects that actually link countries together in infrastructure, bridges and railways and things like that. But the amount of resources you need are absolutely enormous. And those banks also have their own bureaucracies and ways of doing things that don't necessarily move as quickly as one would like. But they're certainly a very important part of the architecture of doing things. And then the question of the lingering impacts of slavery and colonialism. I talked, one very vivid example for you is during the COVID-19 um, pandemic in 2020. If you actually disaggregated and looked at the figures, because African Americans had been denied their rights for 250 years, and then structural issues have ensured that they live in, many of them at least, live in poorer neighborhoods that are not serviced by hospitals, and you have asbestos and all sorts of things in those areas. Even though they're about 14% of the US population, they were accounting for about 30% of deaths from COVID-19 as a result of some of those structural issues. So things like poverty, things like people working in jobs where you need to actually have contacts, subways and things like that, where you need to have contact and you're more exposed to COVID-19. Those kind of structural issues are still there. In the Caribbean, many people point out that much of the diabetes and things like that that exist there today in disproportionate numbers can be linked to some of the sugary drinks and bad diet of the slavery era. In the African context, you can clearly see the damage that colonialism has done. In a country like the Congo, you had less than 100 university graduates to service that massive country the size of Western Europe that must have had a population of maybe 20, 30 million at the time. So you can see that the lack of infrastructure, the lack of socio-economic development, the lack of services, hospitals, all sorts of things as a result of the extractive, exploitative nature of colonialism has left its mark on Africa. The fact that some of the most able-bodied Africans were the ones that were taken out of the continent, and many communities were depopulated as a result. Regional integration, crafts, entrepreneurship, that's all the stuff that was destroyed as a result of slavery as well. So the results are very much still with us. The past is not yet past. Thank you very much. In terms of decolonizing curricula, it's absolutely essential. And I can tell you what I did while I was actually here at the University of Johannesburg. We had a project which was funded by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which tried to look at lessons for decolonizing South Africa's curriculum, but looking at the rest of the continent and also some examples of African American studies. So we got together some of the activists, student activists that had been at Rhodes, at the University of Cape Town, at WITS, to record and document some of their experiences of how they pushed for curriculum reform and decolonization. We also got together some of the most established people in the higher education field, Shireen Motala, Crane Sudian, Ahmed Bauer, also to look at what South Africa had done in terms of transforming its curricula. But more, and we were looking at just the humanities, but more importantly, we looked at what had been done in the rest of the continent, because one of my criticisms of South Africa is that it tends to want to learn lessons from the West and sees itself as not an African country. I guess that's something that's deeply inherited from the apartheid era. So it often thinks it doesn't have things to learn from the rest of Africa. But from the 1950s, Africa developed schools of excellence. For example, there was an Ibano School of Historiography that was developed by people like Adekeye and Kenneth Dike that tried to write Africa's history and debunk the Eurocentric idea that Africa had no history before the Europeans arrived, and trying to use oral sources and oral history to develop an African historiography. And much of that work became the textbooks, not just in universities, but in secondary and primary schools in post-independence Nigeria. In the case of Senegal, you had the Dakar School of Culture, promoted by people like Sheikh Anta Diop and others who were also trying to do similar things. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who just died, the Kenyan writer, along with a South Sudanese and Kenyan colleagues, did the same thing at the University of Nairobi with the English curriculum, arguing that you can't just look at English literature from a Western point of view. You have to take Africa as the central point to look at it from. So much of what people like Edward Said, the Palestinian American, and Chinua Achebe were also arguing. And then in Dar es Salaam, there was a Dar School of Political Economy, led actually by people like a Guyanese economist, Walter Rodney, who were, many of them were Marxists, but they were trying to, create a kind of African epistemology that would look at political economy and social change through an African perspective. In the African American case, we looked at W.E.B. Du Bois' Atlanta School of Sociology, and also at Howard, which is a historically Black college, there was a School of International Affairs that was created by people like Ralph Bunche, Eric Williams, and others, Merz Tays. And so we looked at this in terms of, is it possible for South Africa to try to replicate some of these? Not exactly, because you can't just take templates. It has to be within your own environments, but at least to try to make your curriculum less Eurocentric by looking at how others have gone about it. And I think that's certainly a case. The book was published, was titled From Ivory Towers to Ebony Towers, Curriculum Transformation in the Humanities, edited by Shireen Motala and Sheon Teller. And I think it's a 2020 book. So that was our contribution to the debate. And I think it's certainly very relevant today, because I don't believe that curricula, even now, are still transformed. I mean, I went and did a review in a history class recently at the University of Pretoria, and I was quite shocked still to see the same dead white men on this curriculum on South African history when there's so many good black, African, as you call them, Indian colored scholars that have made contributions, and also so many good women, solid women scholars as well, that one could have on there. And sometimes, VC,
Yes.
the most surprising thing is that these are curricula of senior black scholars. So I'm not quite sure why we have that. In his economics also, I gave a guest lecture at University of Pretoria, again a black lecturer, and I just couldn't believe why they would have just Eurocentric economists when you have Samir Amin from Egypt, Adebayo Adedeji from Nigeria. There's so many people that you can have and include Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is now head of the WTO, a very able Nigerian woman who has also written several books on her experiences. So I definitely think that's something that's important and that needs to change. Last question, I think, was from my sister here. How do we overcome the hatreds? Even within countries, there's a lot of hatred, or maybe hatred is too strong, but there's a lot of ethnic animosity. Even in this country, there may be people that think that there may be Zulus that think they would never marry vendors. There may be all sorts of other prejudices against Soto or other speakers. Limpopo, there are lots of stereotypes, BC. They say Limpopo does witchcraft.
I'm not from Limpopo.
No, but your predecessor was.
Yes.
And whenever there's thunder, there's all sorts of things they have to go and hide, things like that, So you have all these stereotypes in every society. In my own society in Nigeria, there's also a lot of animosity. We fought a civil war, mostly for the Igbos to try to break away. But I think you have to try to forge that unity, and it takes leadership. But also, one of the things that helps is if you can increase the pie, prosperity. The hatred in Europe was so much that every 20 years they were fighting wars, and they were also developing technologies that was able to, on an industrial scale, destroy themselves even better. So the First World War, maybe 10 million European youths destroyed. By the Second World War, Russia alone lost 20 million people because all this war technology was getting better and better. And if a continent as bloody and savage as Europe, which was fighting wars all the time, it didn't have many periods of peace, could come together and unite on the basis of an economic union, there's no reason why the African continent can't develop the vision and leadership and innovation and know-how to be able to do that. Obviously, it's going to take time, and it's not something that happens quickly, but I think we all have to be leaders in trying to do that,
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Adekeye Adebayo. Prof, I wish we had more time. You brought back memories when you talked about Nollywood. One of the characters I'll never forget is Mr. Igbo. There's a movie, Mr. Igbo. Is it Igbo? Mr. Igbo goes to London. And he goes to a corner shop and says, I want akeke bread. And they don't have it. He says, what kind of people who don't eat Adekeye bread? Ladies and gentlemen, it is Steve Biko who once said, and I quote, the great powers of the world may have done wonders in giving the world an industrial look, but the great gift still has to come from Africa, giving the world a more human face. We should continue as Africans of all colors. Now, when we talk about Africans, I'm not talking about, black like me. I'm talking about all Africans. We have to continue to give the world a human face. Ubuntu, we talk about Ubuntu. We should also continue to believe in ourselves. We need to continue to break those barriers that prevent us from working together. But it's platforms like this, it's the work that you're doing, and God bless you. Please continue to write and publish, speak, without any fear or favor. Thank you for always making time, to engage with other people. That is how we'll take our continent forward. Yeah. And may we continue to pray for wise leaders that will lead us, into the future. May we also pray for energy, for wisdom for our students, the young generation, because you are the future leaders. What is left of me, ladies and gentlemen, is to thank our guests today. Thank you very much, Prof. We should meet again, to engage some more. Africa is huge. We can never discuss it for 1 hour, 30 minutes and say we've done justice to Pan-African challenges and so on. So we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. You're always welcome here at the great University of Johannesburg. So, ladies and gentlemen, tea is served. Enjoy the remainder of this beautiful afternoon. Thank you very much.